Welcome back. Amid the pressure of COVID-19 pandemic, the domestic cigarette industry is now haunted by other pressures coming from an increase in excise rates, where the government has declared to raise cigarette excise rates in 2021.
The performance of the cigarette industry is under heavy pressure after COVID-19 pandemic has reduced public consumption. The pressure will be heavier if the government increases cigarette excise rates next year. The Association of Indonesian Cigarette Manufacturers, or GAPRI, estimates that cigarette production will drop by 30 to 40% this year. GAPRI Secretary General Willem Petrus said that the corona pandemic contributed 19% to the weakening performance of the cigarette industry. Then the excise policy dragged sales down by 11%, where in early 2020, the government raised the tobacco product excise rate by 23% and the retail selling price by 35%. As for next year, it is planned that the excise revenue target will increase by 4.71% to 172.75 trillion rupiah. Seeing these various pressures, Willem said that cigarette excise rate doesn't need to increase again, especially because of unstable performance in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. He even advised the government to increase state revenue through extensification of custom goods. Meanwhile, the Fiscal Policy Office of the Ministry of Finance stated that the increase in the target for cigarette excise revenue next year is to cover the rising budget deficit amid the corona pandemic. The government cannot cover expenditures by only tax revenue because the business sector is also weakening. From all sources, for IDX Channel.
The domestic cigarette industry is anxious about the government's decision to raise cigarette excise rates, which are said to be announced in the late September or early October. And yes, a number of opinions have been conveyed, especially requests from the industry players for the government to postpone the decision. Before we go further, let's see the actual cigarette excise rate in the first graphic. This is percentage of Indonesia's cigarette excise. In 2015, as much as 8.72%. In 2016, the cigarette excise in Indonesia implemented as much as 11.19%. Meantime, in 2017, 10.54%. 2019, 10.04%. The same percentage is implemented in, or was implemented in 2019, 10.04%. But in 2020, the percentage of excise increased significantly to 23%. Based on the data, the government has increased cigarette excise rates by more than 50% in the last 6 years and will even increase it again in 2021. And regarding to plan to increase excise rates, it's in line with the increase in the cigarette excise revenue target in 2021, where the Fiscal Policy Agency stated that the increase in the cigarette excise revenue target next year is to cover the rising budget deficit amid the corona pandemic. And increasing cigarette excise is one of the strategy to reduce the deficit, because so far it has contributed more than 90% of excise revenue. And of course, because the government cannot rely solely on tax revenue. Meanwhile, the government said that this policy also considers efforts to control cigarette consumption, where the government targets to reduce the prevalence of smokers aged 18 years and under to 8.7% by 2024. So with the government's high expectations on cigarette excise, how much has cigarette excise contributed to state revenue so far? The data is on the next graphic. This is the contribution of cigarette excise to state revenue in 2015, as much as 139 trillion rupiah. The trend keeps on increasing from 138 trillion rupiah in 2016 to 164.94 trillion rupiah. It is predicted to reach that level by the end of 2020. Meantime, in 2019, as much as 164.8 trillion rupiah. The Tax Research Institute, DDTC, predicts that this year's tobacco excise revenue will not reach the target. It will stuck in the range of 99.2%, or a potential shortfall by 1.37 trillion rupiah, or only reach 163.6 trillion rupiah. Several things have caused the excise revenue target not to be achieved this year, namely the complex structure of tariffs and tobacco products, as well as the increase in excise rates and erratic retail prices. Meanwhile, in the 2021 state budget draft, the revenue from tobacco excise is targeted to increase by 172 trillion rupiah. And viewers, with such contribution to the state revenue, how big is domestic tobacco production annual? Let's move to the next graphic. This is the domestic tobacco production. In 2015, it was contributed a lot compared to another year in 2015, as much as 193,790 tons. But it was keep showing fluctuative trend. In 2019, it was contributed as much as 197,120 tons. But in 2020, it is predicted to produce 185,000 tons. And regarding the impact of higher excise rates, the lower absorption or production of tobacco is also said to be inevitable. Besides that, another impact is higher cigarette prices, which threatens the existence of the industry itself. Therefore, tobacco farmers urge the government to reconsider the plan to increase cigarette excise. The farmer asked the government not to make policies that would worsen the industrial situation. Apart from affecting tobacco farmers, the biggest impact is, of course, on labor absorption. As we know, this industry is one of the labor-intensive industries in Indonesia. To find out more clearly, we're going to see the next graphic. This is the absorption of workers in the cigarette industry in Indonesia. The manufacturing and the distribution, it was absorbed as much as 4.28 million workers or people. Minsam for plantation is absorbed as much as 1.7 million people. So in total, the cigarette industry in Indonesia absorbed as much as 5.98 million people. We compiled the data from the Ministry of Industry and IDX Channel research. The Indonesian Tobacco Community Alliance stated that the tobacco industry is experiencing various pressures that would impact the survival of 5 million workers, where the pressure not only from COVID-19 pandemic, but also came from the government plan to increase the excise rate for cigarette or tobacco products, while in fact, the sector has a vital role in the economy and development. According to the Ministry of Manpower, the majority of workers in this industry are women of productive age with low educational strata, where many of them are the backbone of the family. You can imagine what if the pressure after pressure on this industry, including the increase of excise, led to an adjustment in the number of workers, or in other words, layoffs. Therefore, in response to the excise policy, the Ministry of Manpower reminded that it must be decided carefully, considering the impact, which is a domino impact. And yes, viewers, hopefully the policy that will be set later will consider the current conditions and situation, and of course, good for all stakeholders. And stay tuned for Market Headlines, because we'll be right back after the break.